Greetings everyone, this is Rambling Collector, back here with another video for all of you today. And I feel like it's been a while since I've done another episode of Reading Reflections, and due to the fact that this one won by popular vote, today, in this episode, I will be covering the classic Song of Ice and Fire series, or also known as simply Game of Thrones, by George R.R. Martin. Now, I have reviewed Martin's works in the past, namely his work Dream Songs, Volume 1, as well as Fire and Blood, in honor of the new show, House of the Dragon. But Game of Thrones was actually the first of his works that I ever read, and in my opinion, it is definitely his magnum opus, and not without good reason. Which is why I'm actually very excited to talk about this one. So with that being said, let's get started, shall we? So what are my overall thoughts on the series itself? Well, for one, I love how it's a more down-to-earth style of fantasy. There are still fantastical moments, such as, of course, dragons and moments of magic, and kings and queens and all that stuff. But more often than not, it's more down-to-earth in a way, because despite having all these fantastical elements, the story itself revolves around people and their decisions, what they make, as well as how that affects the others around them. It's very interesting in my opinion. Not to mention it really dives into the, I want to say, setting of fantasy politics in a way. You have your lords, you have your kings and queens, and it's rather interesting to see them all interact, as well as make their own bids for power in some way, shape, or form. But one of the things I never really thought about after reading this book series was that this essentially takes place in a post-war setting when it first starts, with two rebellions taking place before the start of the series, that being Robert's Rebellion, where Robert Baratheon overthrew the Targaryen dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 3 centuries, and then shortly after he took over, the Greyjoy Rebellion, where the Iron Islands tried to secede from the Seven Kingdoms and got utterly destroyed as a result, thus setting the current setting of Game of Thrones as it is right now. And despite it not being years since then, you can tell that there's still some virtual scars from both of these rebellions still sitting in the world of Westeros. But because of this, the fact that it takes place in a post-war setting, it already gives a very rich history right from the start, and it makes you eager to learn more about this world in general, what its history is, how these characters all know each other. But that only lends further into the amazing world building, both in Westeros and beyond, with great characters that drives the story forward with every chapter. One of the things I definitely feel is one of the greatest strengths of the book series is how each chapter is from a different point of view character per chapter, meaning you get both sides of the story, both from the quote-unquote heroics and quote-unquote villainous characters, all of whom have their own moralities, their own strengths, their own weaknesses, and of course their own primary goals. Some start off completely terrible, some start off amazing, and then become terrible. Like I said before, Game of Thrones, or the Song of Ice and Fire, is more focused on people. And despite that fact that we have various heroic or villainous characters, each one is more three-dimensional than that. And it lends more reality to the story. And quite frankly, I love how this also shows the effects of war, uprisings, and politics of royalty. We see how some plays for power wind up affecting various regions across the country, or even how various uprisings can really just decimate what has been centuries of tradition for one city, but for a stranger, looks to be absolutely terrifying, disgusting, and just downright evil. And I will say, despite the fact that this series starts off relatively light, it progressively heads down a very dark path. Like, I'm not just talking about the Civil War, the War of the Five Kings. I'm talking like apocalypse is on the verge at this point. especially with the current setting of Book 5, and we are still waiting on Book 6 right now. The story is, as of right now, in a major cliffhanger moment, with two major battles on the horizon, as well as more character motivations that are going to be explored further in Book 6 whenever it does come out. And I will say, it has not been easy to wait, but with the supplementary works of Fire and Blood and Night of the Seven Kingdoms, I am willing to still remain patient. And in the meantime, also check out more of Martin's other works besides The Song of Ice and Fire. But I want to give some highlights to my favorite book of the series, in my personal opinion. So I will say it was definitely a difficult choice to figure out which one was my favorite book out of the entire series, not including any supplementary works, just the main series. And I will say, while Game of Thrones is the powder keg that starts off the whole series, and The Dance of Dragons is the precipice to a massive climax that is on the horizon, Storm of Swords, however, has to be my personal favorite, because at a whopping 1,123 pages, and that is not even including the appendix, this one is definitely one of the larger books of the series. And that is not without a good reason, because this one serves as a major turning point for the series, with a lot of established characters that we have come to know and love either being killed or sent off somewhere or undergoing a major change. This one is where it turns to a darker point in the story, because as we were going through books 1, then 2, up to 3, we were at sort of a stalemate, with the War of the Five Kings going on, despite, Renly Baratheon getting killed. And of course, we are left in a massive stalemate. That being said, this is where all that rising action comes to a heavy climax, and then some, with a lot of build-up reaching towards this point, with Jon Snow joining the Wildlings as a spy for the Night's Watch, as well as, of course, Robb Stark and the King in the North trying to keep his wars going in the Westerlands, whilst his kingdom in the North has completely gone into disarray with the supposed deaths of Bran and Rickard Stark, as well as Theon Greyjoy essentially burning Winterfell to the ground. And not only that, we have Stannis Baratheon lurking back to Dragonstone after suffering a massive defeat in the Battle of Blackwater Bay. All of that occurs in Book 2, but now we see even further of a rising action here in Book 3. And I will say this much. This one is the major turning point, and Feast for Crows is just picking up all the pieces afterwards. It shows how all the events that occur in Storm of Swords affect the setting in Feast for Crows, as well as Dance with Dragons has also done this to a very well done degree. But all of this is caused by Storm of Swords, which in my opinion is definitely the most action-packed book of the series thus far. And the reason for this is because a lot of major battles that have been built up to occur in this book, such as, of course, the Red Wedding, the Mutiny at Craster's Keep, the Battle of Castle Black, the Purple Wedding, the liberation of Slaver's Bay. Within this book, you have kings getting betrayed and being assassinated. You have major battles and victories being fought. You have the culmination of this War of the Five Kings practically coming to an end, in my personal opinion. And the reason why I say this is because a lot of the major parties end up getting killed off in this part of the book. In this part of the series, I should say. With, of course, the Red Wedding and the Purple Wedding. Two of the biggest players in this game, Robb Stark and Joffrey Baratheon, are killed. Robb Stark by betrayal due to his own stupidity, and Joffrey Baratheon because he was a monster in human skin that needed to be taken down before he became a third coming of a Mad King, or I guess I could say a second coming of a Mad King. But more than that, the Night's Watch story was what really captivated me the most, because when we left them, they were at the Fist of the First Men, fortifying, getting ready to try to take out Mance Rayder and his army of wildling tribes. But then we see them in the prologue chapter getting absolutely assaulted by waves of the dead, and of course the White Walkers, whom in the book series are known as the Others. We see one of the Night's Watch soldiers as he's caught in this massive winter storm, hearing swords flying and everything else going on, hearing about the dead trying to essentially either tear them apart or eat them one way or another. It's genuinely terrifying and it really grips you from the start. And then, of course, the Battle of Castle Black and the mutiny at Craster's Keep, where a few Night's Watchmen decide to mutiny, kill the Lord Commander Gior Mormont, and then, of course, you had the Battle of Castle Black, where Jon has to fight to show them that he is still a loyal brother of the Night's Watch, facing off against the wildlings that not too long ago he had been on a journey with, including, of course, his lover, Ygritte. But more than that, more than just all the battles, a lot of major characters that have been established in books 1 and 2 are killed off in this one book, including, of course, as I've already mentioned, Robb Stark and Joffrey Baratheon. But not only them, we also have Catelyn Stark, who has her throat slit open, and we see her final moments right before she dies, where she is just sunk into insanity and grief, only to have her later resurrected in the epilogue chapter of this book as, of course, Lady Stoneheart. Sort of a half-dead spirit of vengeance in a way. Not only them, but we also see other minor characters as well, such as Gior Mormont, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, killed in the mutiny at Craster's Keep. We have Joffrey Baratheon getting poisoned at his own wedding, Tywin Lannister being killed by his own son, whom he had convicted to death because he was accused of Joffrey's murder, with Tyrion being the one to put a crossbow bolt into his guts as Tywin is on the toilet. And then, of course, we have Lysa Arryn, aunt of Sansa, Arya, Robb, Bran, Rickon Stark, all of them. She gets killed by her new husband Peter Baelish in his bid for power to take over the Vale of Arryn. Needless to say, a lot of death happens in this book, and Feast for Crows is just left to pick up the pieces afterwards. And, yeah, as I've said, a major turning point. But I think that while this is my favorite book of the series, I also want to talk about some of my favorite characters. So, in regards to my favorite characters, some of you might just be going, I'm not very surprised by that. Some of you might be surprised, and some of you might just be rolling your eyes thinking, of course it's the most obvious picks. And yes, while some of them are obvious, some I'd like to feel are not so obvious. But I will say, these ones definitely are the best characters that I have been following, and I'm absolutely ecstatic to see how they progress in the books. For instance, okay, let me just start with the simple one, Sandor Clegane. I like him because he's a no-nonsense character who doesn't take crap from anybody, and he knows about the harsh realities of the world way too well, because how else are you going to act when your own older brother shoves your head into a fire, burns half of your face, and essentially just goes on to show the falsehood of knighthood in general, how a lot of the knights that we meet are incompetent or just straight up bullies, compared to the actual true warriors who actually care. They are merely legends, or so few and far between that we can barely even believe them, that there is a cynicism to that, our perspective, that we feel like these knights just, they are not as pure as they would like you to believe. Sandor Clegane highlights that very well, due to the fact that he is the younger brother of the ever so famous Sir Gregor Clegane. But I do like how his character and he interacts with both of the Stark girls, with Sansa Stark when she's imprisoned in King's Landing, and Arya Stark when he finds her on the run within the roads, and just watching them interact with him, and how they seemingly change him, or I guess challenge him in some ways. It's very interesting to see how he interacts with other characters, and I would honestly love to get a point of view chapter from him at some point, if he's not already dead in the books, which I hope to God he's not because he is definitely one of my favorites. Now, Tyrion, Jaime, Jon, and Arya. To classify them, all four of them start off a bit lighthearted, a little bit. Jaime, of course, is just straight up villainous from the start, but Tyrion, Jon, and Arya start off the most lighter of the bunch. But as the story progresses, they grow down darker and darker paths, with Jon Snow having to struggle with having to play the double agent amongst the wildlings whilst still serving the Night's Watch as a loyal black brother. Arya Stark, from her perspective, we see the common man's opinion of warfare, just the absolute horror and devastation that civil war brings to the common folk. Because with her, she's essentially on the run as the daughter of a exposed traitor, Ned Stark. And because of this, she essentially has to struggle eventually with her own identity, having to kill many people in order to just survive in some way. She has seen the horrors of war firsthand, and she hates it. But now she has been forced to hide herself for so long that she no longer knows who she really is, and thus has gone on the dark path of an assassin. Jon Snow, we see him dealing with leadership, only to wind up betrayed by the end of Dance with the Dragons, and I hope it is not the end of his story, at least in some perspective. Tyrion starts off kind of funny. He doesn't take much from anybody else because he's essentially the outcast Lannister. And because of this, he's had to adapt this snarky attitude, but you can tell he is very vengeful. Like, the show makes light of this, of his character, but in the books, he goes down some very dark paths. Like, after killing his father and his lover, he doesn't want to just bring about peace like he does in the show. He wants violent vengeance, and I am honestly eager to see how his character will adapt further on within the books compared to the show, which was kind of disappointing. But the one that really caught me off guard was, in fact, Jaime Lannister. I have no idea how, but from his point of view in the third book, where we see his character as he's first a prisoner of the Starks, being led by Brienne to King's Landing, all the way to Dance with Dragons. Somehow, he became one of my favorite characters, just because you see that he himself has his own scars, having to deal with being essentially spat on for the one great thing that he did, which was killing the mad tyrant that he had been forced to serve. And that really just highlights again how, even if you could do the greatest thing ever, sometimes people will still spit at you for it. And Jaime Lannister has had to learn that lesson the hard way, as a teenager, at 16 years old. And because of this, he has had to adapt into a kind of snarky, Prince Charming kind of character, but then in book 3, we see him start to change. He starts to realize he wants to take his knight vows more seriously. He wants to do better, to redeem himself in the people's eyes in some way, shape, or form. And more importantly, I love how his whole relationship with Cersei starts to just collapse because he changes as a character. And then watching him essentially grow to realize that Cersei is not somebody he would want to follow, especially when he starts recognizing some of the madness to her schemes, especially when she burns down the Tower of the Hand and Jaime just looks at her and sees the fire reflecting in her eyes and seeing a possible glint of madness. Like at one point, he actually compares Cersei to Ares, which is terrifying to actually think about. But because of this, Jaime grows as a character, and I'm absolutely surprised of just how much of a fan favorite he has become. But more importantly, I love his story more in the books. They really scrapped him up in the show, but the books, I'm definitely eager to see more. So, random thoughts. Fun fact, I actually did not watch the show until at least season 6, because I had read the first 5 books first. So while the show was still going on, I was mainly focused on finishing the books first. And then I started with season 6 of the show, after Jon Snow was killed. And I guess from there it didn't really hit as hard when the final season came around. And, well, nowadays I can definitely say that it was very heavily rushed towards the end. But considering the fact that the books themselves are not finished yet, I'm kind of curious to see how Martin will change it up compared to how the series ran with it. So I'm very curious to see that play out. But I will say, one of the moments, or at least a few moments in the series of the books itself that shocked me was, for one, watching Ned Stark get killed. I did not expect one of the main characters introduced in the first book to be instantly killed off by the first book. So then it was kind of funny to me how Sean Bean, as Eddard Stark in the first season, he gets killed, and I found out that apparently he makes a career out of playing characters that are going to die. I just think it's kind of funny now that I look back at it. But some other shocking moments for me was when Tyrion finds Shay in his father's bedroom, and he just straight up coldly murders her. Like, not even with a knife or anything, he just strangles her to death using the chain of the Hand of the King, which, that alone was a very shocking moment. And it was definitely one of the most darkest moments. And other than that, the Red Wedding itself really shocked me, especially just like, because it's from Catelyn's point of view, you really feel the pain, the insanity of it, realizing that things are going horribly wrong. At first, it starts off pretty light, with her brother essentially getting married to one of Lord Walder Frey's daughters, only for while the wedding ceremony is going on, all of the major wedding guests are shot up with crossbow bolts, and you watch your son get stabbed in the gut by one of his loyal lords. Just yikes, first of all. And I will say this much. Whilst I am still waiting patiently for book 6, it is starting to grate on my nerves of how it feels like Martin is taking his time, but more than that, it feels like he keeps getting sidetracked by taking part in different shows, which, on one hand, I don't mind, because it means he's taking an active role with more of his creation. But at the same time, considering the fact that Dance of Dragons has been out since 2011, and Winds of Winter is still being written, I'm wondering, and I'm praying to God this never happens, that we don't get a Robert Jordan situation where Martin dies before the book series is finished. I pray that we do not have another situation like that. Just, it's very frustrating. I love this series. I respect the man for what he does, but at the same time, it's very frustrating. I'm sorry. That's just my thoughts right there. But with all this being said, those are my overall thoughts on Game of Thrones, or at least the Song of Ice and Fire series. But now, I want to ask you, my fellow watchers and readers, what's next? Which series would you like me to cover next? Would you prefer the urban fantasy series of Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, or the overall classic J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series? Now keep in mind, this would not be everything, it would just be the main 3 books. But I will leave that up to you all to decide. And if you did like this video, feel free to leave a like, comment your thoughts on it down below, and more importantly, just let me know what you think, which one should be covered next. And once again, you guys, thank you so much for listening to this crazy man's ramblings. It means a lot to me that you take the time to listen to these videos. And more than anything, I hope you're enjoying this new series of reading reflections. And I'm sorry that it has taken so long for me to produce a new episode for it. But more than that, you guys, thank you once again for listening. And if you did like this video, feel free to click the subscription button and stay tuned for more. And once again, thank you for listening, my fellow readers. This is Rambling Collector, signing off. Have a great day.